We have come to the last lecture today, which I must say I'm especially proud of be able to present James Corbett. I have written to him for 3 years to have him to come. Last year he had a good reason because they had a little baby.
I still do.
I think there was quite. How many of you follow James Corbett on a reasonable basis? See, James, a lot of fans here. And I think most of you will say, is there any subject James don't know anything about? Yeah, that is. So, and I think everybody is looking forward to this brain you have with sharp analyzing based on solid research and even presented in an easy way to understand, even for Danes. Yeah, as you saw, you had a lot of supporters from here. Maybe you don't see it too much in your comment field or blogs, because Danes, they don't blog. But I will say, I think we are many people here who are looking forward to hear James Corbett's lecture, Echoes of World War I, and your analysis of what is going on in big politics and what can we expect in the future. So please give a warm welcome to James Corbett.
All right. All right. Good evening. Let me start by thanking all of the staff and organizers and volunteers and Frank and Michael and Greg and all of the people who have put this together. It's an incredible amount of work to put a conference like this together, so I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be here tonight to talk to you. And of course, thank you to all of you for having made the effort to come out and see me tonight. I very much appreciate that. I arrived in Denmark a few days ago, and my entire understanding of Denmark comes from things like the philosophy of Søren Kierkegaard and the fairy tales of Hans Christian Andersen, the political machinations of Anders Fogh Rasmussen, and the films of Lars von Trier. So you will forgive me if I was a little bit hesitant as to what to expect when coming here, but I'm pleased to report that the Danish people overall have been exceptionally generous and hospitable, and I very much appreciate all of the kindness that has received me so far. So I'm looking forward to talking to you tonight, but with all of that pleasantness out of the way, let's turn to the unpleasantness of today's topic. It may be observed that our relations with Germany, if not exactly cordial, have at least been practically free from all symptoms of direct friction, and there is an impression that Germany will think twice before she now gives rise to any fresh disagreement. In this attitude, she will be encouraged if she meets on England's part with unvarying courtesy and consideration in all matters of common concern, but also with a prompt and firm refusal to enter into any one-sided bargains or arrangements, and the most unbending determination to uphold British rights and interests in every part of the globe. And these are the words of this man, Sir Eyre Crowe, who was a high-ranking officer in the British Foreign Office in that period in the run-up to World War I. And he was commissioned by Edward VII, King Edward VII, the royal rake, the brothel-goer-in-chief, to write a memorandum on the present state of British relations with France and Germany, which he delivered to British Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey on January 1st, 1907. And as you can see, even at that time, several years before the outbreak of World War I, the Foreign Office and the various military planners were very much thinking along the lines, even within their diplomatic gobbledygook, of being firm with the Germans. Fast forward to today, and we have 100 years from now, this is what they'll remember: what we did to confront China on its rise to world domination. China right now is Germany in 1930. And we're going to war in the South China Sea in 5 to 10 years. Interesting pronouncements, and I would perhaps aver that perhaps China right now is Germany in 1910, but at any rate, I think the sentiment is well taken. And these are the observations of that top-ranking, prestigious geopolitical commentator of our times, Steve Bannon. What swamp did he crawl out of exactly, anyway? But if that's a bit too cartoonish, let's go even more cartoonish. Of course, looking back at the propaganda of a previous age, it seems almost quaint by today's standards that anyone was moved by these images rather than laughing at their ridiculous, over-the-top nature. We have the germ Huns, not Germans, germ Huns, literal germs, lice that need to be disinfected. We have the Schweinhund, bring home the bacon. We have the brutes, the mad brutes, who are literally going to take our virtuous women and have their way with them unless we stop them. This is the Huns are coming, the propaganda of 100 plus years ago. But today we are sophisticated. We don't rely on this kind of crude propaganda. We have much more well-crafted, shrewd propaganda with a nice little techno beat to go along with it, if that's your thing.
Tonight at 10, a rare glimpse of China's ambitious expansion in one of the world's most contested regions. We report from the South China Sea, where the Chinese are warning off anyone who comes too close to their building program.
We continue our look this morning at what China does not want you to see. The United States says the superpower is reclaiming land in the South China Sea.
China's alarming creation of entirely new territory in the South China Sea is one part of a broader military push that some fear is to challenge U.S. dominance in the region.
I firmly believe that our People's Liberation Army has the confidence and capability to defeat all invading enemies.
They've staked a claim to thousands of acres of what were sandbars and reefs. They've used sophisticated equipment like these ships, pumping sand through those thin tubes to create islands. Then they built airfields with towering radar stations, constructed ports, deployed weapons there, even built barracks.
The fact that we're dealing with a situation right now where the U.S., has to be much more aggressive in dealing with the Chinese government.
So as you see, this is nothing like the propaganda of a century ago. It's much slicker. But propaganda it is nonetheless. This is echoes of World War I, China, the US, and the next Great War. And the thesis that I'm going to present to you tonight is not a wholly original thesis, for the most part. You are going to see this, in fact, increasingly talked about probably from this point. And it has been talked about by such prestigious figures as Heinz Kissinger himself. And I'll spare you for my impersonation of Mr. Kissinger, but in 2011, he wrote his weighty tome on China. And in the epilogue to that tome, he wrote about that same Crow memorandum that we opened tonight with, asking the question, does history repeat itself? And he asked the question. A number of commentators, including some in China, have revisited the example of the 20th century Anglo-German rivalry as an augury of what may await the United States and China in the 21st century. There are surely strategic comparisons to be made. At the most superficial level, China is, as was Imperial Germany, a resurgent continental power. The United States, like Britain, is primarily a naval power with deep political and economic ties to the continent. He goes on to ask, will history repeat itself? No doubt were the United States and China to fall into strategic conflict, a situation comparable to the pre-World War I European structure could develop in Asia, with the formation of blocs pitted against each other, and with each seeking to undermine or at least limit the other's influence and reach. But before we surrender to the presumed mechanism of history, blah, 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 he goes on to say, don't worry, guys, it might not develop into warfare. which is a remarkably similar note to one that was struck quite recently, just in the past few months, by a new book by Graham Allison with the foreboding title of Destined for War. Can America and China escape Thucydides' trap? And, well, Thucydides, who's that? This is, of course, the 5th century BC Athenian historian and general, and he's best known for writing the history of the Peloponnesian War, which is commonly referred to as the first work of scientific history, the use, the collection, and the examination of evidence and facts from the historical record to come to an understanding of the cause and effect flow of history. Why did this happen? How did this happen? Rather than in previous historical works just invoking the gods to explain when and then this happened. So this is an important writer and a landmark in the history of history. And as a result, it's still taught to this day in Army war colleges in the United States and elsewhere. And it's even, the history of the Peloponnesian War has been referred to as the favorite neoconservative text on foreign affairs by none other than Irving Kristol, so it probably is. And the question is, what is Thucydides' trap? Well, as Graham Allison writes in the preface to his book, as a rapidly ascending China challenges America's accustomed predominance, these two nations risk falling into a deadly trap, first identified by the ancient Greek historian Thucydides. Writing about a war that devastated the two leading city-states of classical Greece 2.5 millennia ago, he explained, "It was the rise of Athens and the fear this instilled in Sparta that made war inevitable." Inevitable. Which is an interesting word to be using. And to be fair, Graham Allison goes on, like Henry Kissinger, to say, well, it's not necessarily 100% the case that we're going to war with China. In the book, he elaborates, I believe, 16 different examples of this Thucydides trap event in the past 500 years of a ruling power being challenged by a rising power. And of those 16 examples, 12 of them resulted in war, 4 did not. So he presents that as a learning opportunity. How can we discover, well, why did it not go to war in these cases? I think some of the cases that he cites are a long stretch to describing the current situation. For example, the rise of Germany as an economic power in the European Union, displacing the economic power of Britain and France in recent decades, I think is not quite as relevant as, say, the World War I example is to what we see developing with China. But at any rate, this idea has been forwarded by people like Graham Allison and has been heavily promoted in the last few months. If you go on YouTube, you'll find just in the past few months a number of conversations that Graham Allison has had about this book that have been hosted by people like CIA Director David Petraeus, or ex-CIA Director, disgraced CIA Director David Petraeus, and Miss Humanitarian Love Bombing herself, Samantha Power, and Henry Kissinger. So this idea is right now being heavily promoted by some people who are in a position to know, which is interesting because I did select the topic for this presentation before this book even came out. Great minds think alike? At any rate, if there are similarities between the build-up to World War I and our current historical era, what would those similarities entail? Well, we can identify, for example, the phenomenon of the Thucydides trap, a rising power coming to challenge the dominance of a ruling power. Entangling alliances that enmesh these various powers in webs that make it more likely that they'll lead to confrontation. There's competition in a military sense, competition for resources, trade competition, and an invasion hysteria that is being whipped up in the public by a complacent media. So I think we can identify all of these things in the pre-World War I period and in today's period. And let's get into some more specifics. So the idea of the Thucydides trap, the rising power that's coming to displace or threatening to displace a ruling power, if we're examining it in the World War I context, of course, we're talking about the rising power of Germany coming to threaten the then dominant power of the British Empire. And there's a lot of different ways that we can formulate that statistically or tried to encapsulate that, looking at gross domestic product of Germany as compared to Britain, for example, in that period from 1860 to 1913, keeping in mind that Germany as a nation state only actually came together in 1871, which of course kicked off the period of rapid industrialization that caused a rapid growth in economic and military clout of the German, formerly German states, now German state, which was presumably the cause for the panic that ensued. So looking at GDP, you'll see that Britain was always able to maintain a healthy gap between British GDP and German GDP until we approach the turn of the 20th century, at which point Germany continues on a parabolic upward curve, whereas Britain is putting its might into trying to increase economic productivity, but not doing quite as well. And at that point, around 1910 or so, Germany actually overtakes Britain in terms of GDP. If you want to look at the military side of things, German and British warship tonnage, because of course this was primarily and I think famously a naval race, Britain was able to maintain a hefty lead over all other nations, including Germany in naval capacity, but Germany did put on quite a show and certainly did massively increase its naval capabilities just in the last decade and a half before the war. So these things were obviously seen as concerning, alarming, perhaps, depending on what position you were in the British aristocracy or kakistocracy. Similarly, if you want to compare that to today, the idea of a rising power of China coming to threaten to displace the ruling power of the American empire. And again, we can map this out in various ways. Again, if we want to turn to gross domestic product, a very inaccurate measure by any means. It's not really a measure so much as an estimate, and even then, there are different ways of estimating GDP. So that if you measure GDP in purchasing power parity, for example, PPP, various groups, including, I believe, the IMF and World Bank, have estimated that China has already surpassed the US economy. But even if we're to measure GDP in nominal terms, the Rothschild economist reckons that by next year, 2018, China will meet and then surpass the US gross domestic product of $20 trillion. So we're just on the verge of that takeover. And keep in mind, Germany surpassed Britain just a few years before the outbreak of war. If we want to look at military capacity, military buildup, I don't think there's any satisfactory way of encapsulating this in a handy-dandy infographic. And I think every infographic I've ever seen that tries to do so does so in a very ham-handed way. There's a lot of ways that you could dispute what information is trying to be conveyed here, but I think the general idea that China is becoming more of a military, I don't want to say adversary or threat, but at least a power that's capable of projecting its might within its own region, at any rate, is certainly a phenomenon that we're witnessing. This graphic that I have here displays, for example, the ground forces of the Chinese PLA, the People's Liberation Army, are just by sheer numbers larger than the US, as would be expected given the fact that China has a population over 3 times that of the US. So more actual troops themselves, all members of the forces, more artillery and battle tanks. But I think that's a misleading statistic in a lot of ways. When it comes to the naval side of things, I think, again, clear superiority on the US side. But China is gradually catching up in various ways, and you can see that reflected, for example, in submarine figures and things like that. But when it comes to destroyers and combat aircraft and aircraft carriers and these types of things, again, the US naval dominance, I think, is not really in question at this point, and is not feasibly in question in the near future. But I think the idea is that China is at least becoming more militarily capable. If we want to talk about entangling alliances, this is probably about as deep into the history of the First World War that, well, at least I received back in my Canadian education, indoctrination. The Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance. So you had Germany and Austria-Hungary and Italy forming pacts in the 1870s, 1880s that became the backbone of the Triple Alliance. And then you had Russia and France and Britain forming the Triple Entente, and they had different relations to the Balkans and Bulgaria and Serbia, and the Ottoman Empire is in there, and all the dates are in there, so there will be a test after this. Please study very carefully. The Venn diagram is confusing enough, but it could be made much more confusing when you add in other relevant parts of this diagram, which would include Japan and Belgium and how they slotted into this. But it's tempting to just say, okay, so there was an alliance and there was an entente, and it kind of led everyone into war. I believe Kissinger called it the diplomatic doomsday machinery that led to World War I, as if it just suddenly appeared somehow and it was just a fait accompli and it goes. But I think that's a glossing over an exceptionally, for people who want to study the actual history of the period, it's exceptionally important to just even look at some of the dates that form around these. For example, look at Britain and France and Russia forming that Triple Entente and think, even in the 1890s, even in the early 1900s, 1901, 1902, the idea that Britain and France would be forming any type of alliance or entente or whatever it may be called, after 1,000 years of military confrontation and struggle is something. That is something. How did that come about? Or Britain and Russia, which had been squabbling over Afghanistan and Persia and coming head to head in various other places, suddenly becoming best buddies and becoming joined at the hip. That's a fascinating part of the puzzle for people who want to know, what was World War I really about? How did it really come about? Who was behind the creation of those alliances? And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but there's quite a bit of detail there that we could go into. But at any rate, this is the Entangling Alliances that generally, the story that we've all heard, there was a assassination in Sarajevo on the 28th of June, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and bada bing, bada boom, Entangling Alliances, World War. Okay, well, that's not a very satisfactory explanation, is it? If you want to compare that to today, the Entangling Alliances of the pre-World War III period, question mark? Again, I'm not sure there's a single graphic that could possibly encapsulate this idea, because there are so many different possibilities, alliances of various sorts. One way of graphing that might be to look at the NATO member countries, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, versus the Shanghai Cooperation Organization members. The NATO, of course, coming together in the Cold War period as a North Atlantic Security Alliance, increasingly erroneously named because at the moment it's probably most infamously embroiled in the occupation of Afghanistan. North Atlantic? I don't know. Someone buy them a map. And this graphic isn't even really representative because, yes, the NATO member countries might be those countries, but now it has these strategic partnerships and alliances with various players all over the globe. Korea and everywhere else have these quasi-alliances with NATO that make it a truly globe-expanding organization at this point. And I've talked about that with Rick Rozoff, for example, on my podcast before. So it's quite an amazing thing to watch. Not an amazing in a good way, perhaps, but the creation of this NATO monstrosity. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, on the other hand, is sometimes referred to as a kind of counterbalance to NATO. I think that might be a bit overblown, at least at this point, but it is some form of political, economic, and military cooperation agreement body that, of course, includes China and Russia and some of their pals there in Eurasia. That's one way of graphing this. As I say, there are many different things that we could be looking at. We could be looking at the European Union. We could be looking at the BRICS. We could be looking at organizations that span both China and Russia, from the United Nations to the World Trade Organization and others like that. How do we make sense of that? And what does that mean if this does come to actual confrontation? Not so clear, but at any rate, I think the idea of entangling alliances could be said to exist today. It's just a question of which alliances would be activated in which way by what kind of event. If we want to look at military competition, in the pre-World War I period, there was no doubt there was a massive military buildup across the board. Every single one of the major powers of Europe was arming steadily, and the figures might be difficult to read on this map, but for example, the UK going from $308 million in contemporary US dollars spending in 1908 to $368 million in 1913. Germany going from $356 million to $573 million. Across the board, everyone was arming feverishly, perhaps no one more feverishly than Germany itself, for various reasons. I mean, clearly, again, this was a build-up to war period in which it was quite evident that Germany was in the crosshairs, and I think they could read the tea leaves as to what was happening. So, again, military competition, military build-up, quite, certainly from our perspective, quite easy to see, and I think even at the time it was easy to see and notice what was happening. Military competition in our own era, how do we graph that? Well, we can look at regional military expenditures from 1988 to 2012 and see that North American region has enjoyed a very, very robust military expenditure increase since 2001 for reasons that should be obvious. And keep in mind, when we're talking about North American military expenditures, we are talking about American military expenditures. Canadian and Mexican military expenditures would not even be a blip on that chart. And the other region that has had prominent and strong growth during the entire period is the Asia and Oceania region. And again, when we're talking about the Asia-Pacific region and military expenditures, we are primarily talking about China, as you can see in this other graph where yes, there's been some increase in military spending from India, a little bit of increase in Vietnam and places like this, but by far the lion's share of increase in military expenditure has been coming from China. So we have the picture here of the US and China definitely engaged in military buildup. Now, let's keep the relative figures in mind because, again, the United States military expenditure dwarfs absolutely any and all competitors. China is number 2 at this point, but number 2 by a very, very long shot. And the US military expenditure of the official expenditure over $600 billion a year at this point. And that's just the official on the books expenditures. I can't remember how many, but on the order of the next 10 largest military expenditures combined is about equivalent to what the US is spending every single year. So again, let's keep the figures in mind, but from the perspective of a ruling power being threatened or feeling threatened by a rising power, any sort of bridging of that gap, however minuscule, could be seen to be part of this picture that we're painting here. If we want to talk about resource competition, pre-World War I, perhaps most notably in the age of neo-imperialism at the turn of the 20th century, the late 19th century, most notably taking place in Africa, specifically the scramble for Africa that was taking place from the Berlin Conference in 1884 onwards, when the colonial powers agreed to their gentlemanly rules of how to carve up and control the African continent. So, of course, every colonial power and would-be colonial power of the time was scrambling to get its claws into the African continent. Obviously, France taking a good portion of the northwest of the continent. Britain obviously represented in the east and in South Africa as a result of the Boer War, which is an interesting part of the World War I story that many people might not think of as part of the World War I story. Even the Danish colonial empire, of course, having its holdings on the Gold Coast of Africa. But perhaps most notably, Germany, which, again, let's keep in mind, was only consolidated as a nation-state in 1871 by this period in the 1880s, 1890s, scrambling for its own colonial holdings in Africa, reading the mercantilist tea leaves and realizing they needed to take part in this colonial quest. You had German West Africa, German Southwest Africa, German East Africa, and German New Guinea that were carved out. So that is a nice microcosm, I think, of the overall picture of the resource competition that was taking place generally, but certainly in Africa in the 1880s and 1890s, it was becoming most evident. And as a result, of course, that's the point at which certain conflicts started to come to the fore, like Germany and France in Morocco, which was a presage of what would become the First World War in some respects. If we want to look in our own era, the idea of resource competition, again, I think Africa would be a good way of looking at this. And on the left, we have a map of the various investments or investment proposals that China has ongoing in the African continent, spread out across a large section of the continent and involving all sorts of different infrastructure projects and other projects that will ultimately result in what China likes to call a win-win situation. China gets the resources, they get to buy the resources, but Africa gets the investment of infrastructure and other things. That's the China in Africa map. And then on the right side, we have the US in Africa map, which if you do an image search for the idea of US presence in Africa in their current day and age, you'll find invariably this is a map of US military presence in Africa. And even then, somewhat, maybe not a complete map, but this is the sub-Saharan nations currently with a US military presence is represented here. But of course we know that the US, for example, has obviously had its claws into Libya and Egypt and elsewhere on the continent in recent years besides, and has, since 2007, established the US African Command as part of the military quest to consolidate control on the African continent, which is widely seen, and even in the mainstream media, reported as a type of counterbalance or a block in the road of China and its development in Africa. And this is something that obviously is not lost on the Africans themselves. Muammar Gaddafi, in 2007, in an address to the students at Oxford University, actually made this point about how there are two models that are vying for control in Africa. There's the Chinese model, which is about infrastructure investment and spending and cooperation, and there's the US model, which is based on military occupation and bombs and bullets. And he said, quote, "Because of that soft approach, Africans are welcoming China warmly. This will no doubt be to China's benefit. Africans are wary of the US because of its harsh approach. This is proof of the folly of American policy." And we all know what happened to Gaddafi 4 years later at the hands of the NATO-backed goons that were sent into his country. So, making his point for him, perhaps. If we want to talk about trade competition in the pre-World War I period, we would have to include at least some discussion of the Berlin-Baghdad Railway, which, despite its name, was a proposed railway from Berlin all the way down to the Persian Gulf city of Basra via Baghdad. That was the result of a concession that was won from the Turkish Ottoman Empire government by Deutsche Bank, which was spearheading, it was a group of investors that were looking for this concession to create this railway. In the 1880s, it started to come together. And this was seen as exceptionally important for Germany in a number of ways, one of which, on even a surface level, of course, Germany needing export markets for its growing industrial production. Turkey could provide some market for that. But also, this being a line down to the Persian Gulf, which would potentially, assuming things were to develop as they had been developing and the age of neo-imperialism continued, Germany would need some sort of direct access to its colonial holdings and to its trading partners around the world. The Persian Gulf would be a nice place to go from, so this would be a very strategic asset for Germany overall. As part of the concession, they actually got, I believe, 20 miles on either side of the railway that would include mineral rights and oil rights in a very oil-rich region, so lucrative in that sense as well. Britain looked at this Berlin-Baghdad railway proposal and said, "Oh my God, it's not just you can put freight production on these trains and send them down there. You can send soldiers down there, and that's what they're planning." So Britain was very worried that Germany would use this for some sort of military strike, threatening the Suez Canal, perhaps, and threatening to cut off British access to its Indian colony, or cutting off supply lines for the oil, which was increasingly important even at that time, as Britain had just switched its navy from coal-fired vessels to oil-powered vessels. The story of the undermining and scuttling and ultimate irrelevance of the Berlin-Baghdad Railway is something that I told it in part in the How Big Oil Conquered the World documentary. So if you're interested in a little bit of more history about that, you can consult that documentary. But suffice it to say, it did eventually actually get completed in 1940, but by that point it was not exactly the strategic asset that pre-World War I Germany was looking for. If we want to look at the comparison to today, trade competition in the pre-World War III era, OBOR, OBOR, OBOR. If you haven't heard of OBOR yet, you are going to. Starting tonight and probably a lot in the near future. One Belt, One Road, specifically the Silk Road Economic Belt and the Maritime Silk Road Initiative of China, which is a plan to create this vast trade routes, both overland and overseas, that will consolidate Chinese shipping and trading in the entire region. It's a grand, incredibly audacious project, which could be up to $1 trillion of investment overall when all is said and done, and includes all sorts of infrastructure projects in all sorts of different places. If you want to look at a Berlin-Baghdad parallel to what's going on today, just earlier this year, the first freight train made the 12,000-kilometer journey from Beijing to London. So the Beijing-London Railway is already in existence. If you want to look at other elements of this, China just last month opened a naval base in Djibouti. Why would China be interested in opening a naval base in Djibouti? You do not have to be a keen geopolitical strategist to understand, just from looking at a map, the incredible strategic importance of Djibouti there on the Gulf of Aden with the, I always forget, Bab el-Mandeb Strait, which of course is very important to have, if not control over, at least access to, if you are planning to ship resources, say, out of Africa up to Pakistan and then on to China. It's an extremely, exceptionally important part to have a naval base in, which is presumably why that has just been opened. All sorts of other projects taking place. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor alone, $60 billion of proposed investment so far. Everything that's taking place in the region right now seems to be under this One Belt, One Road initiative idea. So it is massively transforming the entire region, including Southeast Asia, including Eurasia. And that's a pretty significant thing. If we want to talk about invasion hysteria, the whipping up of panic about the enemy, in Britain, that was taking place in the pre-World War I period through the auspices of various media organs, including the Daily Mail, which commissioned the publication of The Invasion of 1910 by Mr. William Lequeux. This was a story that was serialized in the Daily Mail in 1906, and it was the fictional account of an invasion of the eastern shores of England by those dastardly Germans. And I just have the sort of regular-looking cover here, but in my copy of Hidden History, The Secret Origins of World War I, there's a picture of a different version of that cover where it's Kaiser Wilhelm holding the globe, literally about to take a bite out of it like an apple because he's so rapacious for land that he just can't contain himself. He's going to eat the world, which gives you, I think, a sense of what this story is about and what it's attempting to do. And it was wildly, massively successful in that endeavor. It was sold through ridiculous tactics, newspaper vendors dressed up in complete Prussian military garb with a spiked helmet and everything to sell these newspapers. And it was massively popular when it came out in book form. Again, a massive bestseller. It was commissioned specifically by, let me get the name correct here, Alfred Harmsworth, aka Lord Northcliffe, who became part of the clique, the set that was clearly engineering the conditions for World War I. And this is no small part of it, whipping the public into a hysteria about the enemy that's coming for them. So is there invasion hysteria in our own era? You bet there is. Pieces of literary gold like Invasion by Eric L. Harry or Invasion China by von Heppner. It's so imaginatively entitled. And I will confess I haven't read these turgid tomes of no doubt trash, but but I suppose I will have to. The things that I do for you guys, I swear. I suppose I'll have to stomach through some of it just to see the gist of it, but I think we can tell, even from the cover art, let alone the reviews, etc., what these pieces of writing are attempting to do. Perhaps most interestingly, and the one that will go to the top of the to-read list, is Ghost Fleet, a novel of the next World War by P.W. Singer and August Cole. And this seems to be a particularly interesting one because, as the foreignpolicy.com website wrote about last year, and for you, those of you who don't know, foreignpolicy.com, very much a globalist mouthpiece. Kissinger's mini-me, David Rothkopf, was I believe the founder or co-founder, at any rate, the chief editor for a number of years. He stepped down, I think, earlier this year, but still, clearly a globalist mouthpiece. And they had a piece on Ghost Fleet last year, in which was titled, "A Novel About War with China Strikes a Chord at the Pentagon." And they note that US military officers are reading Ghost Fleet as a cautionary tale on how to prepare for great power clashes in the digital age, which is made all the more interesting because neither P.W. Singer nor August Cole are actually novelists. They have no previous experience with fiction writing. They just found themselves writing this for some reason. P.W. Singer is a military analyst known for his nonfiction books, and August Cole was a former Wall Street Journal defense reporter. And as foreignpolicy.com notes, the Ghost Fleet is unusual for a work of fiction because it is loaded with nearly 400 footnotes, meticulously documenting the real-world roots of the fictional fights. You want to talk about predictive programming? That sounds like one to add to the film literature in the New World Order series. So yes, invasion hysteria, but if fiction is not your thing, there's nonfiction invasion hysteria as well. For those of you who don't know, this is Peter Navarro, the author of such works as The Coming China Wars and Death by China. A very, very subtle writer in so many ways. Really beautiful use of language. No, he is an economist who writes about the economic aspects of the Chinese threat to the American economic hegemon, and he writes about counterfeit goods and China currency manipulation and issues like this in a very tabloidy, trash talk style. I wouldn't recommend that you read him, but if you do, I guess I could say that he writes kind of psychedelic fever dreams of a particularly sinophobic William Burroughs, like Naked Lunch, Target China edition or something. I don't know how to describe it, but many, many years ago, I was in Canada, in my hometown, and I was at a used bookstore or a flea market or something, and I came across a book that the cover was so gripping I just had to buy it. It was $1 or something, so why not? It was the title was ... To Hell with Canada. And the book was the most bizarre rant of some crotchety old man. I don't know, I'm assuming this was some self-published book or something. It was just so bizarre. And I remember one of the points that he made was that these hockey players are flying all over the country going to their games. We should scrap the National Hockey League and save jet fuel. It was bizarre. I should see if I still have that book, actually, dig it out. But that's kind of what the style that Peter Navarro reminds me of. He reminds me of that bizarre, crotchety old man creating these strange visions. And although you can't really read this is a screenshot from The Coming China Wars, where he's writing about the problem of counterfeit goods coming from China. And he says, to understand the very real dangers of these counterfeit goods, consider these fictional scenarios, which, he assures us, are all based on real-world events. Although this book contains absolutely no footnotes, unlike Ghost Fleet, which has 400 footnotes. So whatever real-world events these are based on, I don't know. And how did he fictionalize them? I don't know. But it starts off, it's a list of fictional scenarios that he's created, which starts off fairly innocuously. It seems plausible enough. Your scalp develops a severe rash because your knockoff Head & Shoulders shampoo from China contains toxic chemical residue. Okay, fair enough. I'm sure I'm sure that things like that do happen. Then he gets progressively weirder in his fictional scenarios here. He writes about your Himalayan lap cat dying from liver failure due to Chinese poisoned tick medicine. We can all relate to that one. And he ends on this fictional scenario, which I hope I can read without laughing. On a sultry summer night, two of your coworkers, a 22-year-old gay man and a 24-year-old heterosexual woman, buy fake Durex Extra Safe condoms at the same pharmacy. Later that night, in separate encounters, the condom burst. The gay man gets HIV, and the woman contracts chlamydia, which renders her sterile. These are the fictional scenarios that he spends all night dreaming about, I'm sure. Just bizarre. And it's funny, it's laughable, it's stupid. If it weren't for the fact that Peter Navarro is Trump's National Trade Council head. He is the head of the National Trade Council in the United States now. Death by China, indeed. So, if this is what is happening, and if we do see these parallels, what can we learn from the history of World War I about what we are experiencing now and what we may experience in the near future? Well, this is a piece of history that goes much further back than the build-up to World War I. Some of you may be familiar with this. This is a representation of the Battle of Copenhagen of 1807, which is a piece of history that I assure you we do not learn in Canadian history classes, but I would hope that you learn here. For those who don't know, of course, during the Napoleonic Wars, Britain was very concerned that Denmark, neutral Denmark, would have its fleet seized or used, or have the Baltic Sea shipping lanes cut off from British use by Napoleon coming up and allying with or conquering Denmark or whatever. So the British had a simple solution. August 1807, they sailed their ships in, bombard the city. A neutral country, not an enemy, sneak attack, kill 195 civilians, injure 768, seize, confiscate the entire Dano-Norwegian fleet, just because they could fall into the hands of Napoleon. If you want to talk about sneak attacks, we always talk about Pearl Harbor. Maybe Copenhagen of 1807 would be a better example. But as appalling, as disgusting as this example of history is to you and me, to the military planners of the pre-World War I era, they said, hey, sounds like a good idea. This was Admiral Sir John Jackie Fisher, a name that maybe is mostly lost to history, at least regular folks. Naval and military historians might know him. But he was the first Sea Lord, the head of the British Royal Navy in that pre-World War I period. In fact, he was he appointed first Sea Lord in 1904 and served until his retirement at the age of 70 in 1911. He came out of retirement to become first Sea Lord again in 1914 because he didn't want to miss that party, a party that he had been preparing for a very long time. As soon as he came in as first Sea Lord, one of the first things that he recommended to his royal rake, the brothel goer-in-chief, Edward VII, was, hey, remember that Copenhagen 1807 thing? Why don't we do that to the Germans? And if you go and read his memoirs, which are available on archive.org, you can browse through them online, he brags that he was one of the most hated men in Germany during that period because word had gotten out to the Germans that he was making this proposal. So obviously Britain didn't go that route, but it was on the table at any rate and being suggested by some very high-ranking people. Do we have an equivalent from today? Unfortunately, we do. This is Admiral Scott Swift, the head of the commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. And last year, he was asked, if you were to receive an order from the commander-in-chief, the President of the United States, to make a nuclear attack on China, would you do it? And his answer was essentially yes. Yes, I would. And he goes on to say, well, of course, because The commander-in-chief is the head, and I've sworn a duty to protect the Constitution from all invaders, foreign and domestic, and to uphold to fulfill the duties of serving the president, blah, blah, blah. So, we leave it, I guess, to the historians of a future era to go through whatever surfaces from the current administration to find out who was proposing what, and at what times and in what ways. But at any rate, the Copenhagen of the 21st century may be a Hiroshima Copenhagen. So, what happened during World War I? Actually, maybe a better question is what didn't happen during World War I, because it's hard for us today to even conceive how fundamentally the world changed during the course of the First World War. Not least of which, the change that took place in the conception of what war even is. What does war look like? How is it waged? Was an entirely different question at the turn of the 20th century as it was in 1918 after the First World War. The invention, of course, of all the technology that had completely transformed the idea of warfare, even if they were still thinking along the lines of conventional warfare. So we have the situation of the trenches and the no man's land and the machine guns. We have airplanes and poison gas that completely, fundamentally change all metrics of what war is and how it is waged, and changes the game entirely. It's the again, probably one of the few things that people learn about the First World War. It's the Germans were relying on the old Schlieffen plan to go and, blitzkrieg through France and then hightail it back to Russia to get them before they can mobilize, which was a stupid plan and they shouldn't have done it, is basically the idea. But I think nobody had a real conception once the war started exactly how it was going to look. The change in the monetary paradigm. So I should say, yes, similarly, I think World War III, I don't think we can conceptualize what that even means, what it looks like. The only thing that I know for sure is that it will not look anything like World War I or World War II or previous military confrontations. It may not even be primarily military. Economic warfare, cyberspace wars, space wars. Again, our conception of what this will look like with 21st century technology is, at this point, only theoretical. Let's hope it maintains that way. The change in monetary paradigm. So at the beginning of World War I, the world was on a gold standard. It was largely abandoned during the course of World War I, leading, for example, in Britain in 1925 to an act which repealed the old gold species standard and replaced it with a gold bullion standard. So there was massive changes that were happening in the monetary paradigm as a result of the war. And we are seeing some massive changes in the monetary paradigm right now. You may have seen, I did a recent video about China starting the Shanghai Energy Exchange, on which will be an oil benchmark denominated in yuan. And so, for example, Russia can sell its oil to China directly for yuan, and take those yuan and change them on the Shanghai Gold Exchange, which opened up last year, for gold. So there's really oil for gold possible that completely goes outside the US dollar system right now. It's a fundamental change. There's some very, very large changes that are happening right now that may not seem so important at first, but could very well be a complete change. Change in government, I don't just mean change in the actual members of government or something, but I mean even in the conception of what government is and what it can do. And probably the most obvious example from my Canadian perspective was the Income War Tax Act of 1917. Of course, Canada saying, hey, we're in the middle of this big war. We got to keep the troops clothed and fed. We're going to just do this temporary little income tax, just take a little bit from you every, And trust us, guys, it'll only be absolutely for the soldiers. 100 years later, the soldiers apparently still need clothing and feeding. I don't know, those World War I soldiers must have been really hungry. In Britain, there was an income tax already, but it was greatly increased. The number of people that were subject to income tax greatly increased during the course of the war. In the US, 1913, the year before the outbreak of war in Europe, we saw both the passage of the Federal Reserve Act and the amendment that created the possibility for, or there's controversy about that, but theoretically created the authority for an income tax in the United States, which again started off minuscule, tiny. But in 1917, there was the War Reserve Act, which greatly increased the US income tax. And at that point, even people who had been very, very much against the idea of an income tax before the war, by 1917 and the outbreak of US involvement in World War I, those voices had been silenced. Redrawing the world map, of course, famously, so I should say, of course, in World War III and World War III scenario, one can imagine how much further governments might have to go, depending on what way that war is waged. Again, if World War III is a cyberspace phenomenon, then how are you going to crack down on that other than the militarization of the internet? Or, at any rate, a driver's license to get on the internet, or something along those lines. So again, people's conception of what is possible, what is feasible, completely changes during the course of a war, which you'll be familiar with if you've seen Norman Dodd's testimony, one of the researchers for the Reese Committee in the 1950s, researching the tax-exempt foundations, who had access to the Carnegie Endowment minutes from the foundation of that foundation in 1908, where he said, for the first year, the board deliberated in this very intelligent, very, very high-level way. They deliberated what is the best way to change society. And over the course of that year, they came to the conclusion that there is no way better than war to change society's outlook. And so they set forth from that point in taking over the apparatus of the US State Department and the US foreign policy and setting the US on a path towards war, which they managed to embroil it in several years later. As Norman Dodd memorably said, I don't think anything could have been further from the minds of the average American at that time in 1908, 1909. But there they were planning it. Redrawing the world map, again, I think famously, so many of the conflicts that exist today, for example, in the Middle East, stem from the maps, the lines that were drawn on maps in conference rooms in Versailles in 1919 that have no basis in reality other than this was done as a concession to this person or that person, or they had a good lunch that day, so they decided to draw the map this way. And that we still feel the effects of that today in places like Syria. Redrawing the world map in the future, how will that be done in the event of a World War III scenario? Again, that's an interesting thing to think about. Will it look anything like what we understand today? And then what future wars will that facilitate? Rise of new entities and powers. Obviously, before World War I, there was no Soviet Union. After World War I, there was the Soviet Union. Most dramatically, but again, many different countries were formed as a result of that map drawing. So what new entities or powers might arise in a World War III scenario? It may be something not China, not US. It may be something different altogether. May even be the wonderful globalist institution that's going to come down from the clouds to shepherd us into peace at the end of whatever havoc may be in store. And as I say, fundamental change in consciousness itself. What is possible, what is impossible. People's minds were shattered by World War I. It's hard for us from our perspective to understand how fundamentally that shook the beliefs of much of humanity, that you could at least put history in some sort of sense that there's progress and we're working towards a better world. No, everything just fell apart. My mind is blown. I don't know what to believe anymore. That was the effect for a lot of people of the First World War. And how can we say what would happen in the event of a Third World War? But perhaps the most important part of this lecture is the part that we'll spend almost the least time on. But this is the fundamental underlying point of these machinations. World War I was an engineered conflict. It was not, as we are taught, there was an assassination in Sarajevo and then bada bing, bada boom, World War. There was a concerted effort, as I say, with the consolidation of the Triple Entente in the years leading up to World War I, as a kind of pincher movement to flank Germany on the east with Russia and on the west with France, so that Britain could get these powers to help fight their dirty war for them. Absolutely, there was machinations going on that were deliberate and were understood at the time, even though historians don't like to admit that. Probably the best single volume encapsulation of that is Hidden History, The Secret Origins of World War I by Gerry, Doherty, and Jim Mcgregor, which is a very, very interesting read. I think they may overplay their thesis a little bit so that every single thing that happened pre-World War was all part of this plan. But at any rate, I think they do make a convincing case that there was definitely a concerted effort to engineer a First World War. And we would be naive to think that any moves towards World War III are not similarly being engineered right now. We see it with things like the invasion hysteria, which again is obvious propagandistic nonsense, but it is designed to get the average person with their popcorn and beer watching the MSM to go, I hate those guys, let's bomb them. And unfortunately, I think we all know people for whom that kind of propaganda actually works. But not just the propaganda. I have outlined in my podcast and on my website numerous times the ways that this type of engineered conflict is coming together, perhaps most notably, at least foundationally, in episode 297 of my podcast on China and the New World Order, talking about how there was a consolidated, coordinated plan to make China into the economic and industrial engine that it is today. We have to understand that history in the context of who was the one who opened up relations with China. It wasn't Nixon. It was Kissinger, who went the year before Nixon to prepare the way. And who is Kissinger? He's Rockefeller's protege. And normalization of relations continued apace during the Carter administration with Zbigniew Brzezinski, another Rockefeller protege there, steering things towards that. And then we have the 1980s and the development of various institutions, organizations with Rockefeller right there in the heart of the mix that are creating business and banking and financial ties that lay the framework, the groundwork for the industrial explosion and productivity explosion that we've seen in China over the past couple of decades. This didn't just come out of nowhere. It wasn't just China woke up one day and decided to do this. It was a coordinated effort that involved the participation of the elite, no, that's a horrible word, the powers that shouldn't be from the US side as well as the powers that shouldn't be on the Chinese side. So this is the underlying reality of this. And I think it's important to keep this in mind because the most insidious thing about all of this is that in World War I, they got people to believe, at least for a short time, enough to motivate them to go and fight, that they had a reason to fight this war. That there was something, I don't know, king and country, you're dying for some glorious cause, go die. And people did. And they're trying to convince people right now that there is some kind of glorious cause that you're going to go and fight and die for. Just trust us at this time. Well, maybe we shouldn't trust them. This is the story of Stefan Westman, a corporal in the German 29th Division, about his experience in the trenches. One day we got orders to storm a French position. We got in and my comrades fell right and left of me, but then I was confronted by a French corporal. He with his bayonet at the ready and I with my bayonet at the ready. For a moment I felt the fear of death, and in a fraction of a second I realized that he was after my life exactly as I was after his. I was quicker than he was. I tossed his rifle away and I ran my bayonet through his chest. He fell, put his hand on the place where I had hit him, and then I thrust again. Blood came out of his mouth and he died. I felt physically ill. I nearly vomited. My knees were shaking and I was quite frankly ashamed of myself. My comrades, I was a corporal there then, were absolutely undisturbed by what had happened. One of them boasted that he had killed a poilu with the butt of his rifle. Another one had strangled a captain, a French captain. A third one had hit somebody over the head with his spade, and they were ordinary men like me. One of them was a tram conductor, another one a commercial traveler, two were students, the rest were farm workers, ordinary people who never would have thought to do any harm to anyone. How did it come about that they were so cruel? I remembered then that we were told that the good soldier kills without thinking of his adversary as a human being. The very moment he sees in him a fellow man, he is not a good soldier anymore. But I had in front of me the dead man, the dead French soldier, and how would I like to have him raised his hand? I would have shaken his hand, and we would have been the best of friends, because he was, like me, nothing but a poor boy who had to fight, who had to go in with the most cruel weapons against a man who had nothing against him personally, who only wore the uniform of another nation, who spoke another language, but a man who had a father and mother and a family, perhaps, and so I felt. This is not an uncommon experience that we encounter in the stories of the people, the pawns, the cannon fodder that actually fought and died and spilled their blood in the trenches in World War I. There was Alan Bray of the Wiltshire Regiment. In July 1915, he was detailed to a firing squad to execute a deserter. He refused to do so. He said, "I thought that I knew why these men had deserted. I understood their feelings and what would make them desert." This is what the powers that shouldn't be actually fear. What if they held a war and nobody came? What if they refused to fight? There's no way to get accurate numbers on this because, of course, the British Army or any other army didn't want them to be recorded, let alone reported. But we do know that there were 306 British soldiers that were executed, put to death by firing squad, by their own fellow servicemen for the crime of desertion or cowardice, i.e. refusing to go over the top when ordered to go basically commit suicide. 306 soldiers killed by their own for the crime of being cowards and not wanting to fight. Of course, since this is such a powerful and pervasive phenomenon, of course, there's going to be social engineering techniques to overcome it. Like the Order of the White Feather, started in August 1914 by Admiral Charles Fitzgerald and his wife, and interestingly, some suffragettes and feminists got on board, but it became a very popular phenomenon. The idea was that a woman would go to a military-age man in England, in London, and if he was not in uniform, put a white feather on him. He is a coward. He refuses to fight. It was a phenomenon that took off. It became very popular to do this, and in fact was so effective that the British government started to worry because men who were employed in services that were in aid to the military, munitions or whatever, were not in uniform and were being labeled as cowards for not being in uniform. This was actually too effective a social engineering campaign, so the British Home Secretary, Reginald McKenna, had to start issuing king and country badges that men could wear to show, I'm not in the service, but I'm an important, this is important for the military. This is the type of social engineering that goes on to make people do things they do not want to do. And we can laugh at this as being crude, ridiculous, but are we really that immune to those types of societal pressures today? They won't look like this, but they'll feel like this. And whether bombs start dropping or whatever type of war is declared or undeclared, the societal pressure to be involved in that, at least to go along with that, to support it in some way, support the troops, will be phenomenal. And people, maybe even people sitting in this room who think they can resist that kind of societal pressure, may not be able to. It's extremely powerful. But this is the point. It's an old sentiment. It's not startlingly new. It might seem corny. It might seem ridiculous. War is over if you want it? That's stupid. That's a pipe dream. Don't spend your days dreaming about that nonsense. Go and fight. But why? Why are they so scared of it? Why do they want you? Why do they spend so much time and energy and money and effort trying to propagandize you so that you believe in this cause? It's A, because no one really believes in it. It's just more BS from the same BSers that always do the same thing. And secondarily, well, because obviously, they care about you and what you feel and what you believe and what you think. Your mind is the battlefield. And it's not about China and US, it's about every person on the planet. It is about conquering your mind, which is why maintaining our cognitive independence and not giving in to the idea that we have to fight anything for the benefit of some Kissinger-esque horrible minion of some global order that we don't want. We have to resist that. And that is our power. Our power lies in our consciousness. So let's end this talk on a more positive note. Don't worry. Even the British government will pardon you eventually, a century later, if you desert or are a coward. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hello, hello, hello. We are really, I will do it like this.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We most probably have some questions, and Carol have a mic which function, I hope.
That would help. I'm going to sit down. Oh, sorry. A little too casual.
Hello, hello, hello. Hi, James. Thank you very much. Brilliant presentation.
Thank you.
I'm an Antipodean, and I'm very concerned about what's going on in the South China Sea. The rise of Indonesia as a probable adversary, their takeover of West Papua and the atrocities they're committing there and in Timor, looking for resources, you know. China's probably going to be doing the same thing if they're expanding into the South China Sea. Are they going to see Indonesia as a potential ally, or are they going to be a adversary? You know, Philippines, Indonesia, Taiwan.
Yeah.
Are they going to group with Australia, New Zealand?
That's a good question. It's a very difficult question because there are so many balls in the air, and it really depends on what form this ultimately comes. I think the most interesting part of this will be the US and its allies' reaction to the One Belt, One Road initiative and the various things that are going on. Because I think China is, for the most part at this point, trying to buy its friends throughout the region, and it's that will always be, there will always be a roadblock placed in their way by military means, if necessary. An example that comes to mind, it's not Indonesia, but I was talking about Djibouti and its importance as part of the trading shipping routes for African resources coming out and going up through Pakistan into China. Well, wouldn't you know it, the port that China has spent a lot of money and a lot of time developing and building up with Pakistan on the southern coast there of Pakistan, the port of Gwadar, is in an area of Pakistan known as Balochistan. And wouldn't you know it, the local Balochis, of course, have their own independence movement, which is now being supported by US congressmen and others because they've seen the light. Yeah, the Balochis are now, this is a great cause of ours. I think that's how this is going to function, at least at this stage of the game that is being played. It's a question of trying to put various roadblocks in the way. So Again, it's difficult to say, and I don't know a lot of the specifics of the internal politics in Indonesia, so I can't really say which way it's tending. But at any rate, that's what I expect to play out generally, and probably with Indonesia as well.
Yeah, hello again. I wish to repeat our appreciation of that brilliant presentation, and in particular how you have outlined the parallel trends leading to World War I and eventually World War III.
Yes.
Now, what may be interesting here is to look at some of the circumstances which may prevent these trends from converging into World War III. And I would like to hear your comment on 3 circumstances which I think differs. One is the advent of nuclear weapons, which makes World War IV will be fought
Sticks and stones.
with sticks and stones, for reasons we all know. Second, one consequence of the opening of Kissinger and Brzezinski is that now the American production apparatus virtually is locally located geographically in China. So, United States produce arms and films, and that's about all. A little food. Third, China has, you know this better than I, but I believe it is 700 billion American treasuries. Is that around that?
I believe upwards of $1 trillion, but yeah.
Okay,
that figure,
close
in
to
that
$1 trillion means that they could pull the plug on the American dollar from one day to another. Maybe that is not an insurance to us, because if it happens that China confiscates or nationalizes all the American production apparatus in China, and if they dump the American treasuries, we have a cornered, wounded tiger, which is not a friendly animal. So how do you see this game being played out? Because it may happen from one day to another. The whole financial house of cards may collapse and things may go out of control.
Okay.
And also the possibility, there are people in Washington who believe that a nuclear war can be won.
Yeah.
And what are their role? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the question. I will attempt to give an answer to all 3 parts. So, with regards to the prospect of nuclear warfare, I think you're right, that does represent something completely different from the World War I era. It's not just a difference in degree, it's a difference in kind in terms of what goes into military planning with regards to this, which is why I think World War III and us conceptualizing it as a military confrontation necessarily and wholly might be the wrong way of going about thinking about it, because I'm not sure that's what if not the military planners, at least the planners, I'm not sure that's the way they see it. And I think that's why economic warfare and subterfuge and Gladio Bead-style terrorist operations and things like that are part of the total warfare that goes into a World War III scenario, perhaps even the most important part. So I agree, the nuclear warfare prospect brings a completely different aspect to this, and there have been crazies in the bowels of the Pentagon since the advent of nuclear weapons, gaming out the possibility of how do we win a nuclear war and how many mega deaths are we prepared to accept. Yeah. So I agree, it's a different game, and that's why I think that World War III probably will not look anything like a conventional military confrontation. As regards to China and its the outsourcing of US productivity to China and how that affects the situation, would 2 powers go to war if one is literally building everything and shipping it over to the other? I mean, how does that affect relations? Actually, I think something that maybe I didn't stress in the presentation, but was worth talking about, is the fact that maybe we think of it, since we're looking at the parallel with World War I, we might think of it as a similar outcome, that you have the rising power of Germany being contained by the ruling power of Britain, which sort of transfers over to the ruling power of America, the Anglo-American power. But World War III certainly wouldn't have to play out that way, and I have a feeling it's not meant to play out that way if it does eventuate. Soros and others have literally referred to China as the engine of the New World Order. Rockefeller, of course, did his ode to Mao in the 1970s in the New York Times on his death, talking about the grand social experiment that Mao brought in. Even if America fought this war and won the war in a military sense, it's not clear to me that America would mean what most people believe it to mean at that point anyway. It will be some sort of merger of these systems with some sort of authoritarian control. But perhaps America isn't meant to win this war at all. Clearly, we are being positioned for the switchover of the US dollar as a world reserve currency. So I think that's in the cards. And I think, again, it's maybe our detriment that we think of these people as being part of a nation state, that a Rockefeller or a Rothschild or whatever has some allegiance to these nation states that they are currently inhabiting. I certainly don't see it that way. And I think that the powers that shouldn't be in America have more in common with the powers that shouldn't be in China and elsewhere than they do with you or I. So I don't think they have any allegiance to America. I don't think they're invested in the idea of America winning a third world war. With regards to dumping of treasuries, China has been, I mean, if we want to look at it in the 2D perspective, just the sort of pieces as they're presented, China has been put in the position of essentially funding the Iraq and Afghan wars. They have accrued this incredible trade surplus and these incredible US dollar reserves, these incredible treasury holdings, which is essentially subsidizing the American empire in its military conquest around the world. And the US keeps printing out these debt notes and saying, haha, take this, take this, take this, you gotta take it. And that's obviously why the Shanghai Gold Exchange and the Shanghai Energy Exchange and these alternative systems are being created. And that's why I think that the dumping of the treasuries, the nuclear option, I don't think that's realistic from any perspective. For China, it would be suicide. If they did it now, if they did it a few years ago even, when people were talking about this quite a bit, it would just be suicide economically. China is still too embedded in the system. I think the point is to build these alternatives and to gradually get out of the system, or at least that's what you would think the point would be. But as I detail in my work on China, the engineered World War III scenario, it's interesting to me that all of these alternatives that are being constructed all seem to feed back in through the back door to the existing international institutions. One example being the BRICS New Development Bank, which was heavily touted, and every mainstream headline said at the time, this is the rival to the IMF and the World Bank. And then when it's actually set up, of course, some of the very same executives who sit on the board of the IMF are running the bank. That's odd. Or China. There was a lot of ballyhoo a few years ago. China is setting up its alternative to the SWIFT network. The SWIFT network is the banking transaction network that sends bank transactions internationally. It's extremely important for the banks to be able to function, basically, do clearing and transactions internationally. And that's why, although the SWIFT network is a neutral organization and blah, 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 but a few years ago, of course, the US said, we don't like Iran, cut Iran out of the SWIFT network. And the SWIFT network said, yes, sir. And they took Iran off the SWIFT network. And suddenly Iran was reduced to phone calls and other things to try to transact business internationally with other banks. It essentially cut them off. So China and Russia look at that and they go, that's a pretty big vulnerability. We should do something about that. So both China and Russia have constructed their versions of an alternative SWIFT network. And a few years ago, it was very much in the financial press anyway, China has constructed their SWIFT alternative. Following up on that, as it starts to develop, a year or two later, it comes out that, yeah, China has now made an agreement with the SWIFT network. So they'll actually use the SWIFT architecture, but they'll kind of rent it out from the SWIFT. So actually, it feeds back in the back door to the SWIFT network. So again, the idea that one idea that we could get is they're creating these alternative structures and they're going to gradually try to step out of them and the US dollar goes down. But at the same time, they're all feeding into the same multinational institutions by the back door, basically. And I don't think there's an alternative that's really being presented to us. Surprise, surprise. I think it's globalist team A and globalist team B, and they're asking you to pick a side.
So just shortly, may we sum up what you just said? The real conflict is not along national fractures. This is obsolete, actually, that picture is between top and bottom.
Yes, if it ever existed, because even 100, 200 years ago, I think the nation-state battles that were taking place were just agreements between royal ruling kakistocracy, who are all cousins anyway. Mm-hmm. I'll send a few million of my people over to die in your soil, you send a few million over on my soil, we'll have a handshake afterwards. I don't think the nation-state idea has ever really applied to the powers that shouldn't be in the way that it applies to most people.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Thank you.
It's sort of connected to the last point. I'm more interested what you think is the specific role of Russia in all that. In my view, they are authentic opponents of this whole New World Order agenda since Putin. There's, for example, the famous talk he gave at the Warily conference in 2014, which was devoted to this whole subject of a world order. I mean, there's extensive interviews where he comes across as quite authentic in his opposition to the New World Order. And if a kind of non-nuclear war in different levels as you expose them would really become a serious threat to Russia, there would always be the possibility to defend with nuclear means for Russia. And in terms of the nuclear triad, there's complete parity between Russia and the USA. And some military specialists even say that Russia is far ahead in terms of electronic warfare capabilities and also in terms of missile technology. So in difference to this former situation, if nowadays the sea powers, Great Britain, America, they could be quite confident in former times that they would not get harmed too much. This is a completely different situation now, especially with in view of these abilities of Russia. And the last point, some even say that Russia has defended against this encirclement with military bases by placing so-called mole nuclear warheads along the whole eastern coastline of the United States, which means that just press a button and a huge tsunami wave covers the whole of the Eastern American coastline. So I mean, they would think 5 times before they start a real war with Russia. So how do you place that?
All right, well, let's talk about the role of Russia in this. And I think, given recent developments in the past year, perhaps Russia seems even more pertinent to this example than China does. I think in the grander scheme, it's China that is being set up to be the Germany of the 21st century. But Russia has clearly taken the limelight in the past year or 2 years. I think at least, if not primarily, at least to a large degree because of internal politics in the United States. But the idea of Russia as a counterbalance to what's going on, they're against the globalists. Firstly, I think the first order to dissecting that is to look at the idea of Russia and what they think, as if Russia is a monolithic entity. Think of it in terms of whatever, if you're Danish, the Danish government or whatever, people can see the subtleties and the differences and this person over here, and no, that's not the same as this person over there. But when we're looking at a foreign country, it's the country, and they all think the same thing. So from that level of analysis, I would say that there are different cliques and factions within the Russian government. The St. Petersburg clique that Putin is kind of part of, that has its own intentions and designs, that is perhaps warring or conflicting with other members of the government, because the government is not a singular thing. And if you look at Putin's finance minister, for example, or the head of the Russian central bank, they're often at odds. So it is not a singular thing. But Putin himself, is he the crusading anti-globalist who's going to save us from the United States? I think not. I think not because I will never trust an ex-KGB to be the head of a country that's going to steer us into a wonderful world of peace and harmony. Call me cynical. But also, actions do speak louder than words. So what are the actions that we can look to? There are actions that Russia has taken that clearly are against the interests of certain members of the overall ruling hierarchy. I agree, and I see that, and kicking out some of the bankers and their minions and things. But what is Putin positively doing, and what is he involved in? Again, I think with the BRICS, I've written about this extensively. You might want to look at an article I've written about phony opposition, the truth about the BRICS, in which I really do not see BRICS as being a significant roadblock to the globalist agenda. I see it as the necessary other side of the dialectic. You have to have two warring parties. There's the warmongers, NATO, the bad guys, clearly. And then there's the good guys, the good globalists that are going to give us the good globalism. And it's the same fundamental underlying philosophy, because look, for example, at Putin and his promotion, his desire to create the Eurasian Economic Union, the EU, that we don't hear much about because it hasn't done very much yet. But it is specifically, consciously modeled on the European Union, with a commission and a council and all of the same bodies. And it's designed that eventually, or the plan is eventually, it's going to create a singular currency in the region, and it's going to start operating like the EU does. It's the Eurasian Economic Union. It involves Russia and some of the Central Asian states. So it's moves like this that make me think, is this really fundamentally opposed to what's going on? Or is it just opposed to certain factions, certain cliques? Yeah, of course there are wars between certain factions and cliques, but I don't think that gets to the heart of the matter, because this is about an ideology. It is about the ideology of collectivism and globalism, the idea that we have to subsume our identity to these larger multinational institutions. And the new world order that the BRICS side is proposing is all about, well, it's a multilateral world order where, China has always been arguing for, we want more representation at the UN and IMF and bodies like this. They're not arguing against those bodies. They say, we want a better seat at that table. And I see Russia in that same category. And I'll believe it when I see more fundamental steps and moves towards really challenging the fundamental underlying idea. But again, there's no country on earth that fundamentally believes in human liberty. The idea of government itself is opposed to that, so how can I ever trust a politician to deliver it to me? The idea of nuclear defense that Russia would have if it's being encircled by NATO, or the idea that Russia is far ahead in terms of military technology with electronic warfare and other things, has certainly been said, and is certainly promoted by a lot of Russian analysts or pro-Russian analysts. But do you really think that the US is showing us all of their technology? Do you really think we know what the Pentagon actually has? If they really wanted to do something spectacular? I don't know. I don't know what they have, but I'm betting we don't know either, right? No one here knows. So take those claims for what they're worth. Yeah, the Russians have shown us some pretty fancy technology. Doesn't mean Pentagon doesn't have it and much beyond it. And the idea of nuclear warheads being used, for example, to set off a tsunami or something like that, clearly it's an option, I guess. But that kind of option sounds to me like back in turn of the 20th century when people tried to imagine 100 years in the future. Well, we've got blimps now, so there will be whole fleets of blimps going across the Atlantic. That's the future of air travel. We can't even conceptualize what's possible with technology that we don't know exists yet. So yeah, maybe nuclear warheads to set off tsunamis, but how about, weather warfare? Maybe that will be the way that war is waged in the future, and how much more effective will that be? Because, how do you even prove it, and how do you know, and who's gonna, most of the public won't even believe that such a thing exists. So is it even warfare? Is it happening right now? Are we engaged in this? Probably, yes. Does that count as World War III? I don't know. So there's a lot of things to think about with regard to that. Thank you for the question.
Keep your question short, please. There's this one, and then you afterwards.
To me, it appears very much as a schizophrenic situation at one place, that basically the US is outsourcing everything, production, wood, steel, computers to China and at the same time attack them. This very much kind of knits in what you said of a power shift, that kind of the US may be supporting its own going down because in the background it's ordered to do so.
Yes, I mean I think that's the fundamental layer of my thesis. And I think that it takes account for some complexity, because certainly not every single person in every one of these institutions is consciously working towards this goal. I think most of the people, for example, in the American military complex or in the political complex, believe they are working towards, winning this fight against China, which they probably really believe is a real conflict, but not seeing that there are string pullers higher above them who have more information and know about certain connections and are pulling strings so that maybe they don't care if all you guys get fried because we got our ticket out of here.
Yes. As you said before, there will be a lot of redrawings around the globe when it's come to the Third World War afterwards. But my question is, how about Israel? Because now in the Middle East, we can see that they are trying to create, United States, Israel, and some other countries are trying to create a new independent Kurdistan. And there's a lot of old maps from Albert Pike in 18th century, where we can see that they are trying to create a completely new Middle East with new borders and new countries in all corners of the region, even in greater Middle East, Afghanistan, Pakistan, over to North Africa. So my question is, how do you see Israel's participation in all these fightings and preparations for Third World War?
Yeah, it's an excellent point, especially because that also relates to World War I with the Balfour Declaration, and which ultimately led to the creation of Israel. So yeah, did you mention Albert Pike? Okay, right. I'd need a reference on that because I know people like to cite the World War III prediction letter, but I don't buy it. But I just think it's not real, and I'll believe it when I see it. But with regards to the overall point, I just lost my train of thought. Okay, so yes, well, with Israel, we don't have to go very far to see their intention to redraw the map. They've written about it extensively and over for decades. At least, perhaps most importantly, going back to the Oded Yinon plan, for essentially what is happening right now. The carving up of Syria, the carving up of Iraq, basically carving up the various players around it that could pose any threat and getting them fighting in sectarian fighting so that there's no one to even potentially challenge the regional dominance. So I think that's not even a conspiracy theory, it's not even a conspiracy fact, it's just a fact. They openly admit it. And it's been detailed in the clean break documents and all of these types of planning documents. And of course, that's the context in which we have to understand why the neocons came into power hungering after the destruction of Iraq. It's not because a bunch of Americans, per se, really cared about what was happening in Iraq. It's because, of course, Israel had a huge interest in what was going on there. So Israel is absolutely, yes, fundamental, and the Israeli oligarchy is committed to the redrawing of the map in ways that will serve itself. I think there's no doubt about that.
Yes, hello. I wonder if you ever have considered the thought that nuclear weapons might not be real, but fear-mongering weapon created by the media, since we only have Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I mean, if you look at the pictures, the smoke plume looks the same of the two bombings. So it's, what do you think about that?
Well, I live not far from Hiroshima. And back when I started the website, so most people probably haven't seen this, but there is a video up on my YouTube channel where I interviewed one of the survivors of the blast. That was a harrowing experience, talking to someone. He was a junior high school student at the time. They were sent out to the fields outside of Hiroshima that day because they were digging potatoes or something as part of the war effort, and saw the blast and saw the destruction. So I personally don't have much skepticism about the existence of nuclear weapons. But I do think that there is room for skepticism about the effects of nuclear radiation. I mean, the existence of radiation poisoning, etc., is, I don't think, really disputable. But to what extent and in what way it functions, they talked about how Hiroshima would be a wasteland for 10,000 years. And, well, I go there a lot, and it's a bustling, thriving city with lots of things growing around it. And Chernobyl has wildlife returning and things like this. So I don't know, but I mean, it's potentially possible that there is fear-mongering around the nuclear issue, and that would make sense from a strategic point of view for the oil industry that sees obviously a competitor in the nuclear energy industry. So if everyone is scared to death of nuclear power, then what alternative do you have but keep feeding the oil companies? So that could be one aspect that I haven't done enough research to have any definitive statement on. But as to the existence of nuclear weapons themselves, I don't have doubt about that. As to their, the capabilities of the arsenals that exist today and how many megatons and all of that, I mean, again, yeah, how do we know? But I think there is some sort of nuclear weapon that exists. But they clearly are used as a fear-mongering tool, and have been for 70 years, to condition the public, duck and cover and all of these other ridiculous things, which are now being taught in Japan as well. So, yeah, I think there's an aspect to it that's fear-mongering, but the existence of the weapons themselves, I don't hold in doubt.
I have a question for you about the economy down here. Do you know anything about the cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin and so forth? Do you see those cryptocurrencies as a potential threat to the US dollar empire, bringing it down and taking it over? Or do you see it as a construct of the powers that should not be?
I think that it is a potential threat to central banking itself. It is potentially the elimination of the need for central banks, as if there was ever a need, but even the pretense of a need for central banks, or banks themselves. Through Bitcoin and other technologies that are coming online, peer-to-peer lending and other things, there is the possibility for the complete disintermediation of the entire financial and banking industry as it has existed. Banks are only essentially a function of the fact that we have needed trusted third parties to verify transactions and things of that nature, and to store our wealth, our paper dollars or whatever. But that pretense is gone when you have blockchain technology, distributed ledgers, peer-to-peer technology, where we don't need those trusted third parties anymore. So why do we need banks? Why do we need Visa? Why do we need any of these constructs? Having said that, of course, cryptocurrencies are only valid and useful if they are used in the way they are intended to be used. And I see it, one measure of the PSYOP that's taken place has been to make people believe that blockchain equals Bitcoin. So every time you hear the word blockchain being used in any context, in any way by anyone, it means Bitcoin. And, it always comes back to me to the idea of, well, let's just think of it as a currency and try to put it in dollar terms. So I'm not convinced this is a perfect analogy yet, but at any rate, it may be the start of an analogy. If we think of the blockchain ledger technology as a printing press, and then the dollars coming out of that printing press, Bitcoin was one application of the printing press technology. But you can use a printing press to do a lot of other things. You can print government propaganda. You could print the truth. You could print, toilet paper. You could print all sorts of things with the printing press. Well, with blockchain technology, you can do all sorts of things. And Bitcoin is just one application of that technology and one protocol. Can blockchain technology be used in ways that it's not intended to be used for nefarious purposes or to get people, go chasing down a wrong rabbit hole? Of course, yes. And I'm not committed to Bitcoin per se as a protocol, but I think the possibility of truly, utterly, completely getting rid of banking as an institution is at least theoretically feasible right now.
There's one question, and then one more, and then it's finished. Is it all right, James?
I'll do my best.
Okay, thank you. I have a question about, I actually have two questions. Denmark is the oldest kingdom still remaining in the world, so when we look at history, it's of course obvious for us to look at royal history as well. That's why I'm very pleased that you mentioned Edward VII, considering the Triple Entente, because he was, as I understand, the mastermind behind it. Some people believe that the Second World War was the finish of First World War, what came after the Versailles Treaty, so my first question is, do you believe that the Second World War was engineered as well, because it wasn't on your chart up there? And the second question is that some people, this is still the royal power, and of course we don't have to go more than 100 years back in Denmark to know how big it was, or even just until the Second World War. But some people believe that through royalty, through the Freemason system, Committee of 300, that the royal houses have some power in the real global power structure. And do you believe that England could be controlling United States through the Bank of England, through a Freemasonic system, or in some? So my question is actually, are the royal houses playing in the global power structure, in your opinion?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Good questions. With regards to Edward VII as the mastermind of the Triple Entente, he was certainly the vessel for the creation of that Triple Entente, one that is often excluded from the history. No, it was the Foreign Secretary doing this and that. But clearly, Edward VII was making a bunch of diplomatic maneuvers as he was going around making pleasure visits to various places, and he was instrumental in creating that Triple Entente. But I think we have to understand Edward VII as the vessel for the secret elite, as Gerry Doherty and Jim Mcgregor call it in Hidden History, that he was in alignment with what they wanted to do, so he was allowed to do it. I'm not convinced he was the mastermind, but he was certainly the vessel for that. Was World War II engineered? Yes. I mean, even from a non-conspiratorial angle, I think it's fairly mainstream at this point to say that Versailles and the treaty, the peace, was just the sort of truce that necessitated the Second World War. It was just, it was inevitably going to happen, especially because the war reparations, the clause in the Treaty of Versailles puts guilt for the war on Germany, the entire war. And so reparations, so you got to pay. It was ridiculous. It was outrageous. If they were committed to actual peace, there's no way that would even be a consideration, especially because, again, I think Hidden History and other people in recent years have talked at great length about the extremely, British engineering of that conflict in so many different ways. So in that sense, yes, World War II was engineered. I think in other senses as well, World War II was engineered, and with royal participation and collaboration that was going on, as well as business collaboration that was going on, Standard Oil, IG Farben, royal collaboration that was going on with the Nazi regime. There's so much material there, and I've just been revising and reviewing World War I so much that I don't think I'll get into the weeds of that. But I am planning to do a thorough explanation and exploration of World War II and its engineering. Royal power and where the royalty fit on this scheme. This is where it starts to get a lot of conjectural and me talking about things that I don't know, but it looks like. So, who is at the top of the pyramid? Are the royals really that high up, or are there people above them, and who controls what? Well, we know, for example, we know that the Rothschild family, most famously, but other bankers and banking families as well, became wealthy isn't the right word. It's beyond wealth. It's the ability to control and money and create money, so I don't know what to call that, but became masters of the economic universe by lending to royalty. So there's some relationship there that royalty at least can't exist without these bankers and can't maintain their control without them. So at least to that extent, royalty cannot be solely the power. There has to be some outside assistance that's going on there. With regards to England kind of controlling the US, the Bank of England controlling the Federal Reserve or something along those lines, I think it's pretty apparent if you study the history of the US. From its founding, I think the British were, I mean, I guess you could make the case that they had planned all along that there would be this independence and what have you, but not real independence. Whether or not that was the intention to really incite an independence movement, there clearly was always a design and a plan to maintain English, if not control, at least English, maybe ownership of what was happening in the US. And again, we know this from a direct angle, the formation of the Cecil Rhodes Roundtable, which was geared towards fundamentally the propagation and the expansion of the English power, but of course they call it the Anglo-American establishment because the Anglo-American establishment, they include America in that as part of the Anglo-Saxon people. So, I mean, we know that really the center of that power was in England and was English and was looking for English interests, but they wedded themselves to America as the vessel, the sort of military vessel that they could use for that. So I think, yeah, that's one way of looking at it. I'm not sure it's English control over the US. Again, I don't think it's nation state per se, but there's clearly some nexus there. And should explore the works of Carroll Quigley, including the Anglo-American establishment, to sort of understand that context.
A very, very short question, and the last one. Who there?
Hi. I remember seeing one of your videos earlier, and we were talking about World War II, and I remember you making a statement at one point that Hitler was a Rothschild, or at least a bastard Rothschild. Would you mind elaborating how he was maybe played as a pawn in World War II?
Well, okay, so the statement that Hitler was a Rothschild comes, the research that I was going on for that statement, which I'm not asserting as 100% truth, but as I pointed out, and the reference is in the video, so I don't remember the reference, but it came from, what's her name? Someone here knows. She was an American broadcaster in the 1970s, whose name is going to escape me. But anyway, and she had dug up some of the research that pointed to that possibility, that Hitler was a bastard Rothschild. Which I think is an intriguing possibility. But regardless of whether or not he was literally genealogically a Rothschild, I think there's no doubt that the Nazi German phenomenon could not have existed if it was not allowed to exist in numerous different ways. And again, we can look at some hard data for that. I would point, for example, of course, to Anthony Sutton and his research into Wall Street and the rise of Hitler, where he talked about the economic combine, the relations that had to exist for Germany to function as a war machine in World War II, not having the oil deposits and access to oil deposits. How are they going to fuel their military machine? Well, they had to do so by coal. But how did they do that? Well, the process to create synthetic oil from coal was given to them by Standard Oil. So, I mean, there's all sorts of relations like that that has to be understood to see it in its greater context. And when you see the British royal family that clearly were Nazi sympathizers, I mean, that's really why Edward VIII had to abdicate. And that's why there was that bizarre story a few years ago that came out, early home footage of Queen, a lizard beast, giving the Nazi salute. As a joke, it was a joke. And of course, I mean, it was briefly reported, and I think The Sun or some tabloid posted a few pictures of it, but quickly swept under the rug, never talked about again. That's why Prince Harry comes out at a costume party for Halloween. Ha, I'm a Nazi with a Nazi armband and everything. Ha, it's funny. I mean, there's clearly all sorts of shenanigans going on there that relates to the Rudolf Hess story and what really happened there, parachuting into Scotland, at the height of the war. It was just insanity. There's a big story there that I'd love to get my teeth into, but I have a million other things on my plate. So yeah, I think we have to understand the World War II story in terms of the broader picture, that Nazi Germany could not have risen unless it was allowed to rise. And another important part of that story is also the Bank for International Settlements, which was created as part of the mechanism to handle the reparations that Germany was paying and all of that, that continued to function and work with the Nazi government during World War II as its outlet to the world, without which it, again, wouldn't have been able to function financially, economically. So there's all sorts of different aspects to this, which is why, I mean, it's such a grand thing to talk about with so many moving parts, that again, there are a lot of people involved and enmeshed in that system, just like with the World War III buildup that we're seeing today, that understand and believe and are operating in the 2D system. It's us versus them. But I think there's always the level higher up that sees both sides and is pulling the strings. And that's where we have to keep our attention. Because again, I think if we get ourselves involved in that 2D game and we choose a side here or choose a side there, we lose the one thing that we have, which is our independence and our ability to say no. And as I say, I think that's the most important thing. It's a battle for your mind, and you are the one who chooses if they win or lose that battle. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is an area you don't feel in your office in Canada, huh?
Yeah. No.
Yeah. So, you know, people love you, man. Yeah.
And I love you.
I can't help it. I need to come with one comment to this magnificent presentation, because I think also one fundamental change is that our belief in politicians, even if you are conspiracy theorist or you're just a standard man on the street, is vaporized. So how would they get us all to fight in a war? Nobody trusts a politician. And maybe we even in this country trust the politician most in the whole world. So yeah, I would say they have to come up with a very good campaign to get us into a uniform. But we will see. Again, thank you very much, James. It was a marvelous presentation.